Welcome in. I'm Michael Taylor from Michigan Collaborative to End Mass Incarceration, or MI-CEMI, welcoming you to join us for this communications meeting. We are going to be discussing today ethical storytelling. Having conversations around best practices and ways in order to discuss stories without exploiting those who are affected and whose story we may be telling. Today we have three speakers for you on our panel, um, three qualified speakers on our panels. Number one is going to be Zack Whaley. He is the communications specialist for Safe and Just Michigan. After Zack, we have Mikayla Jones. She is the communications coordinator at Michigan Center for Youth Justice. And then after Mikayla, she will be followed up by Natalie Holbrook, who is the program director at American Friends Services Committee. Um, Before we get started, I would like to tell a little bit about myself. I am formerly incarcerated. I started being affected by the criminal justice um, system probably at age 13 was when I first came into the system. And I have experiences on every level of the system, having gone through and served 17 years in the Michigan Department of Corrections. So I definitely value these breakdowns of how to best tell stories. Um, and I suggest that you sit back and take some notes. And coming up first, like I said, will be Zack Wiley.
Like Michael was saying, we're here to just talk about ethical storytelling, and um, that's something that's really been, I guess, sort of an evolving um, topic for me since I've started this role, and even just before this, there was a period where I was unemployed and started like a podcast where I was kind of telling stories of people who were impacted by the criminal justice system, which worked really well in my interview for this job. But that really forced me to spend a lot of time kind of considering the way that I was sharing those stories, because sort of inherently, I mean, the reason that a lot of us, most of us, are in this work is that the criminal justice system is, at least I believe, sort of inherently traumatic. So when you're sharing people's stories who are impacted by the criminal justice system, oftentimes the story you're sharing is like their most traumatic experience or one of their most traumatic experiences in their life. So obviously you have to approach that with a lot of sensitivity. Um, but at the same time, I've always wanted to make sure that I'm sharing it in a way that is not diluting their experience or sugarcoating it or um, something like that. But anyway, to me, I guess the process really kind of starts with finding a balance between representation and outreach. And what I mean with that is that, as we're considering who we want to represent a campaign or, so a project that we're working on that we need a storyteller for, it's important to make sure that like they are representing the people who are most often impacted by whatever the work it is that we're doing. And at the same time, finding a balance with that and understanding that who is our target audience, just the same consideration we make anytime we're tailoring any sort of communication is first determining like who are we trying to reach, what sort of experiences and what sort of background are they coming from, and how can we speak in a way that's going to resonate with them, and hopefully get them to empathize with the person and the subject in our project. So that's sometimes those balances are sort of antithetical to each other. Oftentimes the people who are already impacted by, say, bail or juvenile life without parole are the people who are familiar with the fact that it exists, and we're trying to reach the people who aren't familiar with the fact that it's a problem. And so oftentimes those people come from different areas, they look different. So there isn't really like, I don't have a solution really for finding a balance between those two things, but it's something that I always try to consider. And I think when we have opportunities to feature multiple storytellers, it's a way that we can do that and sort of get a rounded out sampling. But to me, the basis of the ethics of really anything really starts with consent, and consent really has to start with informed consent. Like, consent can't really be real unless it's informed. And so then to get the informed part, we have to start with the information. So when I'm, doing background interviews with potential storytellers or just trying to get the information around their story, I always start by framing for them, like, why am I even reaching out to you? So, and I do that from a couple different perspectives of what is the mission and the vision of the org that I'm representing? Like, why are we here in general doing this just work as an overarching theme, but also what is the specific project we're working on? And I guess I'll probably refer to this bail reform because that was one of our more recent ones, and also one where we had a really tough time finding storytellers or people at least who were willing to speak. So with the subject for the video that we released most recently that was on bail reform, that was letting him know, like, what is Safe and Just Michigan here for? What are our goals? Because it's a little bit different when we're representing our orgs as opposed to approaching things from like a journalist standpoint, where journalists are ostensibly supposed to be unbiased. People have their biases and those are sort of inescapable, but they're supposed to try to be unbiased. We're not necessarily trying to be unbiased. Like, we have an agenda. We might try to be nonpartisan, but like, we're not wishy-washy about like, well, do we think bail's a good thing? Should we sort of keep it around? I don't know. It's like, no, we're like, we need to get rid of it. That's our position. So making sure that people know that like that's our framework and that's our approach. And then I also always let people know sort of what's my history, like what's brought me into this work, so that they can be informed about like what biases I'm carrying inherently into the way that I'm going to hold our conversation in our interview and ultimately like edit the final product, so that at every step of the way they're still signing on for that sounds okay with me. Either those values are in alignment with me, or they're close enough that I can understand and that sort of thing. So they sort of have an idea of like where things are headed. And then throughout the process, I spend a lot of time setting expectations and level setting. So I have sort of like a form email that I've made at this point that's like pretty long, which I always tailor to like the individual storyteller, but it just kind of goes through the entire process so that they know what to anticipate. And that's everything from, we're going to do this first interview that's on, just over the phone or whatever. It's really casual. It's on background. What on background means is that nothing we're saying right now is on the record. You can say whatever you want. Nothing that you're going to do, like, I'm not recording. I'm going to make some notes. But we're just chatting right now, and I'm doing that so that I can get the information, so that I can do my due diligence on, if I need to fact check some things that you say, or just make sure that you're a good fit for the campaign that we're working on. Nothing right now is, like official yet. And then letting them know what the steps are from there, which are usually, I'm going to, formulate some questions with my colleagues, and I try to give my subjects the heads up on what the questions are going to be. I kind of go back and forth on that because I think there can be an additional level of authenticity if they don't have the questions. But if I do give them the questions, I also let them know that those are just an outline, and that the point isn't for it to be like this scripted, like we're going down the bullet points, hitting these things perfectly one by one. That's a framework, and we'll start with that. And if we get to question one and things just sort of go organically from there, and I don't ask a single question on the rest of the list, but like the conversation goes really well, then great, that's the point. And so I try not to stick to those too much. So I let them know how long I'm typically doing videos, so how long are we going to be filming? I let them know, like, I'm just a one guy crew, so like I'm also going to have to take some pauses in our conversation to kind of check on gear and make sure things are still rolling and nothing's exploded. So we'll have some breaks, and I'll try to put those at places that feel natural, and also let them know that we can take a break whenever they want. And I really just reiterate, I guess, over and over that at any point, again, I guess integral to the concept of consent to me is that consent has to be can be revoked in order for it to be consent. So, if we get halfway through the interview and you're like, this isn't comfortable, like, we can just call it there. Or if we get to like step 9 out of 10 and I'm on like the final draft and I get your, I'm going to get your proof, and you're like, you know what, we need to like, I'm really not feeling comfortable with this. Maybe something happened or whatever. Like, I'll let them know, like, that's okay. Like, I'm not going to publish a story unless I have somebody's like explicit and continued consent throughout the entire thing. And to me, that's really the basics of like the ethics of it. But and then they have multiple sort of stage gates where I get to where I get their sign off on the current like status of the video. So I'll make a first cut, which is usually just focused on the narrative and sort of the underlying audio. I let them know we might film an interview that's an hour and a half, or 2 hours long, and like that might get cut down to like 4 minutes. And so like there's gonna be a lot of stuff that's cut out. So if there's specific things that you really want to make sure that are in there, you can let me know if you feel like those are really integral to your story. But I'll send them that first one, and that's without like soundtrack or titles or any real effects or any B-roll like cut in. It's just that, and it's basically just them talking edited together to get rid of filler words and stuff like that, to make sure that the way that the story is being represented to them feels like authentic and honoring their actual experience. And then we go through some additional iterations, and then once I get the final product, I get their sign off too. And let them know like, here's when we're going to be going live with it. If it's part of a campaign that has funding like specifically for ad spend, I'll let them know like what type of ads might we be running with those. Are they going to be shorter versions of the video? I don't want anybody to be surprised like watching Hulu and all of a sudden they're like their face pops up on the screen and they're like, what the heck, or something. And also let them know like when are they allowed to share the video with other folks, and when does it need to be sort of embargoed and stuff like that. So it's just like really, really over communicating everything throughout the entire process, so that they know what to expect and continue to be able to anticipate what's going on. There's a couple questions in the chat. Do we want to can I answer those now, Michael, or do we want to come back to those later? Or
So I honestly was going to kind of like segue and allow you to answer them now, but
yeah, that's fine.
it wasn't really carved out how if we would answer them all now or answer them as you guys get done. So let's do that now. Let's
Sure.
take the time, and everybody, that was Zack Whaley, and we have a couple of questions in the chat that we're going to go ahead and address now. So let's go ahead and get to those chats. So Chuck put one in, but there was an earlier question also.
Yeah, but I can answer both those. So the outline I can share afterwards if we want. It's yeah, I mean I can share that. I guess that's the answer to that question. So I'll get that to Chuck or Michael. And do we compensate people? We do. And again, that's letting them know like as soon as possible, like what does that compensation take the form of, and what does it cover? What is my anticipation for their time commitment to this? But I also let them know that it isn't intended really to be like an hourly rate. I acknowledge that, like I said earlier, often sharing these people's stories is a really it's a traumatic story, and that there's a lot of emotional labor involved in like recounting that in a very vulnerable way for me, like just personally while we're doing the interview, but then publicly for everybody to see. And so that compensation is meant to be part of that too. And if it's depending on where we find for a location, if it's like in the budget, we can try to talk about covering travel and stuff like that. But I try to come to people as much as I can, so that the amount of time they're having to spend dedicated to our project is as minimal as possible.
Another question. You mentioned being careful about trauma. How does that affect the content and process for your interviews?
Yeah. We've talked about, putting in content warnings with our videos, and so far we really haven't. I think to some extent it's sort of implicit because the work that we do is the work that we do, and so I don't expect people to really be surprised when we're talking about bail reform and the effects that has on people. I was just like insanely lucky to have this amazing training with a really prolific restorative justice circle keeper before I started working at SJM. And I work in a lot of those techniques for restorative justice circle keeping just into the way that I hold conversations that are inherently traumatic. And I think that's it's kind of hard for me to distill that, I guess, down into like here's some quick tips for it. But I mean, I don't think anybody really gets into this work unless they're a fairly empathetic person. And I really think a lot of that is just sharing empathy with the people. And I think trying to sort of pave the way in the conversation too for like that vulnerability. So I always talk about like my history of as a CSA survivor when I'm introducing myself, and that's a lot of my motivation for doing this work. So that kind of clears the floor for like, oh, okay, we can talk about like real stuff. It doesn't just have to be like topical or professional or whatever. Um, and if it's appropriate during the conversation, taking pauses to share like my own experiences that parallel theirs, if that's there. And I think sometimes too, it's just like letting there be uh, like silence, if that's, to let people kind of recoup, and definitely checking in for, letting people, seeing if people want to take breaks. It's always have to be like careful to, because I'll often like talk over people in my video, and that's tough. So you have to make sure that, I'm not doing that. But
Yeah, yes, sir. Yes, sir. So Barbara asked a question, and I think this is important because you kind of led up to this question. Interviews on these topics can get pretty intense. Do you feel there's an optimal time limit to these interviews, 1 hour, 2 hours, or better to come back and follow up if it's too long? How do you handle it when things get emotional? So you kind of alluded to that a little bit. So
yeah, I think I don't think I could put a number on an optimal time. I think, some stories are more in depth, and so I don't want to feel like people are being cut off and sharing the context that they feel is important and the background that they feel is important. At the same time, I don't want to like, dig this deep traumatic hole for people and ruin the rest of their week. Um, I typically shoot the interview and then I shoot B-roll after, and I think that also helps too, because that gives us a chance to, kind of rock. Maybe we do an hour interview and then we spend an hour and a half or so shooting B-roll. It gives us a chance to typically go outside and like go for a walk and just sort of like shoot the breeze about things that aren't necessarily related to this interview. Because I never use the audio from the B-roll, so I just say like, hey, we're just going to talk about whatever. And so I think that helps too, because if I have a really traumatic therapy session or something like that, it's always helpful for me to have some sort of activity afterwards to sort of like get out, and sort of like move my legs and be out, especially outside for me. So I think that's sort of maybe unintentionally worked itself into my workflow with the typically shooting B-roll after that. Um, and I mean, how do I handle things when it gets emotional? I don't know. I cry. Like I lean into it. I guess um,
gotcha.
I don't think I don't know. I just try to be there with people, like, as much as possible, and feel like we're experiencing something together, as opposed to like I'm putting them under like a microscope or something like that. So I haven't been
Gotcha.
on the receiving end of an interview from myself, so I don't know how well that goes. But
Gotcha. Well, yeah, I definitely appreciate that, Zach, and specifically as a podcaster myself, who does interviews with formerly incarcerated people like myself about our trauma and things that we've gone through. I appreciate you even adding in the education piece to be, because you educated me. A lot of times I don't think about my own trauma in a way that I'm able to articulate it in uh, an ethical way, in a way that wouldn't sound harmful, because a lot of it is kind of, I blame myself, I pile it on myself. And
yep,
I know a lot of the people who you may interview do the same thing. So
yeah,
I can appreciate you in the education piece. Um, with that said, I definitely appreciate your speaking, and I would like to move us forward because we have a phenomenal speaker in Mikayla Jones coming up. So I want to kind of talk about Mikayla a little bit. Mikayla joined MCYJ in May of 2022 as their communications coordinator. Mikayla is a graduate of Aquinas College, where she graduated magna cum laude. Now, Mikayla, I had to practice that, right? I was like magnum cum laude or magnum cum laude E. Is the E pronounced or no?
I think just magna cum laude, so you got it right. You're
Okay.
perfect. Yeah.
All right. She graduated magna cum laude with her BSBA in Business Administration and Communications. Mikayla leverages her degree with expertise in marketing to share information in a creative and digestible format while educating MCYJ's audience about juvenile justice policy reform in Michigan. She brings over 5 years of experience in marketing, including organizing and promoting a wide range of events to diverse audiences to the MCYJ team. Mikayla is incredibly passionate about social justice reform and creating a safe space for all to exist, be seen, and be represented. Everybody, welcome Mikayla Jones.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Michael. And thank you so much, MI-CEMI, for having me and letting me speak on this impactful and powerful discussion. I'm really excited and I'm glad that we're all coming together to talk about it because it is a very important topic. I am going to share my screen really quickly. And let me know if anyone has troubles seeing the screen, but it should be a title screen for the presentation. So at MCYJ, oh, sorry, did someone say something? Okay. For MCYJ, we focus on advocating for juvenile justice reform and policy in Michigan. And we're one of the only organizations that solely focuses on youth and their families, justice impacted youth and their families. And I was asked to specifically talk about ethical storytelling when it comes to youth and their families. And to be honest, there is a lot of overlap with what Zack was saying. He had a really amazing presentation and gave some really great golden nuggets of information and experience. And so during this presentation, you will probably see a lot of overlap with what he was saying when he conducts his interviews as well. So before we really, as an organization, dug into what ethical storytelling looks like for youth, we tended to reactively connect with justice impacted young people to share their experiences and stories with us when we needed it to. And we did not always compensate justice impacted young people for their time, and the relationship felt more transactional. This is a big no. This is not what you want to do. You don't want to just have to react when you need a story. And it might even feel like using people in a way to take their stories, and you're not really handling it with as much care that is needed, especially when it comes to stories that might involve trauma or an experience that is hard for folks to relive or talk about. So we put in the work, we stepped back, and we conducted many thoughtful conversations as a team about what intentional engagement really looks like with justice impacted communities. We also expanded our organizational values to have a foundation for interacting with justice impacted young people. So this really set a foundation and a standard for each interaction that we would have with a young person and their family when approaching them to share their story and being that conductor between the young person and the media or like legislators, people of that nature. So in present day, we heavily focus on building authentic relationships with justice impacted young people, and we always compensate justice impacted individuals for their stories and for their time. And this can look like an interview with the press, guest speaking at a virtual event, or testifying in Lansing, among other things. And we also ask for young people's input in our youth centered programming and initiatives. For example, we just started our Voices of Justice Youth Fellowship Program, where we have a cohort of around 7 or 8 justice impacted young people who will learn about different parts of advocacy, including policy and communications, juvenile justice 101, and a variety of topics. And then in the spring, they'll be able to start their own advocacy project of their choice in their communities while working with a justice organization as their mentor, as well as having one-on-one mentorship with our staff. And for that, we wanted to really ask what they wanted to get out of the fellowship, what their goals were, because we wanted it oriented towards them, towards their interests, and towards what would be the most impactful for them. When you're making something for teens or for young people, you need to have them in those conversations. You need to include them in the room because they are the main people who will be affected by whatever programming or initiative that you are trying to create. And building those authentic relationships, as I mentioned before, is so important. Again, before we really became super intentional about this and took a step back, we weren't creating those authentic relationships. It was more so like maybe a one and done type of thing after we obtained a story, which again is not what you want to do when dealing and speaking with young people. You want to be able to build those relationships and really form a connection, get to know them as a person, and what their interests are and who they are as people and how you can help them. So I mentioned our core values that we created as an organization for youth and family engagement specifically. And three that I want to talk about during this session is lasting, transparency, and respect. So the first core value I want to talk about is lasting. And for us as an organization, this looks like building professional relationships that will continue after the initial interaction. So as I mentioned, making sure that relationship is deeper than a simple like transaction, but letting the young person, know you care about who they are as a person. And you can do this in a variety of ways, whether they're and participating in an event that you can attend, maybe connecting with them over lunch, see how they're doing, maybe in school with extracurricular activities, or seeing if they're like in a mentorship program or something that they're involved with that interests them, and just really talking to them and getting to know them without needing or wanting anything from them in return. Doing it without you getting anything back except for building that relationship and that connection. Another core value that is incredibly important is transparency. At MCYJ, we strive to build open communication and trust between our team and the young people that we work with. As professionals in this space, we know that sometimes there's a low chance of certain policies moving forward in the legislature. And we want to make sure that young people are able to set realistic goals and expectations on their advocacy journeys, whether that's setting up meetings with legislators in Lansing or advocating for a policy or reform that they feel really strongly about. We want to make sure that they are in the right rooms and that they understand the process and what might happen when they get to Lansing. And so that they know what to expect when moving forward. We're also transparent about information that we cannot disclose for legal reasons when working with young people. So it's a two-way street, and we want to make sure that we're not an ominous organization that the young person is working with, and that they feel comfortable trusting us, and that we're not and that we kind of just lay all our cards out on the table of this is how we can help. These are the like tools and resources that we can give to support your advocacy journey and to support with what you're doing. And this is like a boundary that we might not be able to say this information for legal reasons. However, we can help in all these other different areas. And last but certainly not least, the core value that I want to speak on is respect, which is an integral part of working with young people or adults, anyone, any age. But we truly work to honor each young person's inherent dignity while respecting their experience, feelings, and comfort levels. Each young person who's just as impacted comes from a different background, different experience. They might have different traumas that they're carrying. And we want to respect that and also respect their comfort level and not crossing a boundary of possibly reliving a trauma by talking about it. And respect carries through all the interactions of working with young people from the start until like after the initial interaction of keeping that relationship and that rapport with each other, including, as I mentioned before, listening to young people's needs and what they would like to benefit from the experience and the takeaways that are important to them. Interactions with the media, best practices. So I just included a couple of pro tips that we utilize when connecting young people with the media. For an interview or if it's going to Lansing and things of that nature, to make sure that young people are as prepared as possible when talking to the media or reporters. So one tip that we strive for is to make sure the youth are fully informed to prepare them for speaking with the press. And this will have some overlap with what Zack was speaking on as well. But we ask for the questions, or if it's more broad, just discussion topics beforehand so that the young person is prepared on where the conversation might go, and they also might know what they want to speak on in the general realm. Of course, as Zack mentioned, sometimes you get a really authentic um, you get a really authentic nugget of information, or you find a trail and it leads off into kind of like a rabbit hole of something really interesting, which is great, especially when it's authentic and genuine and the other person is comfortable speaking about that thing. But we ask for those questions or discussion topics just to put someone at ease in case they might be a little nervous, or maybe they've never interviewed or interacted with the press or media before. We also ask the young person what questions are off limits. Again, setting boundaries is so incredibly important, especially if they've never interacted with the media before, making sure that they know that they are not forced to ask or to answer, a question that they are not comfortable with. Conducting a mock interview can also be a great way to make sure the young person is more comfortable, even speaking in front of someone they don't know. And hopefully, if you have that relationship and that rapport with them, they might even be comfortable speaking with you, where you act as the reporter who is answering or asking the questions that they answer. And so it can be more of an informal setting where the young person can express their experience with someone that they're comfortable with before the actual interview. Another way that you can make a young person feel more comfortable during an interview is offering to be present during the interview, so that they know, they're not alone, that someone's in their corner, that someone's there in case anything happens. And you can finally ask to review the story with the young person before it's published. And that's another thing that Zack mentioned as well, of as he shares his interviews with the person who he interviewed beforehand. That's a great practice to have both ways when interviewing. Another pro tip is that we work on the young person's schedule, not a reporter's schedule. So young people are usually very busy. Like, I know school usually might go until 8 a.m. to 3:30 or 4, but then there's a whole evening that can be full of sports, clubs, things of that nature, where their time is pretty limited. So if you're interacting with a reporter trying to set up an interview and they're being very pushy or refusing to respect the boundaries set by the young person in regard to an interview, you do not need to feel pressure to engage or continue the conversation. You're not working for the reporter, you're advocating and almost in a way representing the young person. And so you don't want to put yourself in this box where you feel immense pressure, like, oh my gosh, I need to get this story or this interview to this reporter by this time and this day, because the reporter at the end of the day needs the story more than the young person needs them. The young person will be fine continuing living their life without having to share their story. And so being able to work with a young person and respect those boundaries, if the young person says, hey, this time, this day won't work for me, especially if it's last minute, you do not need to feel obligated or pressure to engage with that reporter, that interview. And my last tip, again, circling back to what Zack said, because it's so important, is consent. Consent is key, especially if you're interacting with young people. Especially when you're setting up an interview, having a media consent form if their video or pictures will be used, and if the young person is under 18 years old, and confirming the young person if the young person would like to remain anonymous for the story or self-identify. You don't know what situation the young person might be put in. If they choose to self-identify, they might not want maybe their current employer knowing their name is attached to the story, or things of that nature. They might not want their name attached to it. And so just confirming how much the young person wants to self-identify and attach themselves to the story is incredibly important. And having that consent during each step of the process. I know I talked a lot about setting boundaries, and boundaries and consent go hand in hand when working with young people, but even on a broad scope, anyone when they're involved with interviewing in the media. And so that is always a good key to keep in mind. And that was a lot of talking. So I don't know if there are any questions. I wasn't able to see the
Yes,
chat.
there were. That
Okay.
that indeed was Mikayla from MCYJ, and I apologize. Michigan Center for Youth Justice is what the MCYJ represents. But so at the end of that slideshow, you actually kind of covered the first question, but there's a little caveat that I would like to add to the question. So the original question was from Dwayne Golston, and he asked, do parents and guardians get involved if under 18? So you kind of touched on what happens with under 18. Um, and then it was, if so, how does that work? So the consent form for under 18 is one thing, but I'm also concerned, like our parents a lot of times are not involved, I'm assuming, or how does that work with the parents? For
Yes,
18 and unders.
usually if they're 18 and under, you need the parent guardian's signature on the form as well. And so they are a part of the process as well. And we mostly, as I said, advocate for youth policy reform in Michigan. And we're starting, as we've created these core values of youth and family engagement, working more with youth and their families. But we include parents and guardians like as much as we can in the process as well, to make sure that they know what is happening with their young person, and that again the young person is compensated. If they need transportation, we will help arrange that as well, because sometimes there's a lot of happening where people might not have access to a car, or you don't want a young person maybe like riding a bus far away by themselves. So we make sure there's a guardian or someone um, close to the young person who can also be there too.
Got you, got you. And another question comes from Skylar. Is it ever necessary for the folks you work with to discuss traumas that may be particularly difficult? If so, how do you work with that where there's an unethical portion of needing to still discuss the matter despite the difficulty, but it's for an ethical reason or a reason that otherwise cannot be avoided?
I think the most important part is handling it with care, and also still setting those boundaries when you can. So if it was hypothetically a situation where for some reason they absolutely had to discuss this trauma, not making sure that they know they don't have to go into like explicit details if they don't want to, like keeping it vague if they would like to, possibly, as I mentioned, not self-identifying as well, can be ways to protect the young person and also protect them from like reliving explicit details of something that could be triggering to them.
Got you, got you. Well, yeah, there were no more questions on that. So I appreciate you, Mikayla. I will add, you said something about like getting to know them to build lasting
Mhm.
connections, and I do a lot of youth mentoring, and I literally came from facilitation at Peckham here in Lansing to this meeting, and I'm a firm believer that nobody cares how much you know until they know how much you care. So I like the
Mhm.
aspect of like really getting to know them before you even try to get involved in any of that type of stuff, getting to ask them questions and things of that nature. Also,
Yeah.
transparency with this generation of youth. You got to keep it real. They don't go for faking.
Yes, exactly. And it's honestly, I mentioned our Voices of Justice Youth Fellowship, and we had our first meeting with them in person last month. And it was so fun seeing all their personalities come through and seeing their passion for advocacy and getting to know how we could help them and support them, and just seeing them be so knowledgeable about different types of policies or different things affecting their communities. It was truly inspiring. And so I will always advocate for creating that genuine connection with young people when you can, because they'll probably surprise you and you might find just this really great relationship that you didn't have before. And yeah, young people are really fun. So it's great.
For sure, for sure. We appreciate the work you do, Mikayla. Thank you. And thank Michigan Center for Youth Justice. Now, that brings us to my girl, Natalie Holbrook-Combs. Now, reading this bio, she kind of caught me off guard. I didn't even know I could say this. So I'm not familiar with the terminologies. And that is what makes kind of this comms meeting that much more valuable, because it's about ethical storytelling and understanding, how to best articulate these types of things. And I say that because the bio starts with Natalie Holbrook-Combs is a queer mama and a wife and a liberation activist. She has dedicated her life to disrupting prisons and punishment practices. Her work has focused on ending life and long sentences in Michigan and on parole, on parole serving life sentences at Michigan's only women's prison, Michigan's Huron Valley Correctional Facility. She is the program director of the American Friends Service Committee, AFSC, Michigan Criminal Justice Program. In her work with AFSC, she has helped to develop the Let Me Tell You Michigan, the Welcome Home, Good Neighbor Freedom Hub, Personal Enrichment and Parole Readiness Program, and multiple policy campaigns and local narrative change campaigns related to creating more healing and more paths to freedom for long-serving people. Recent campaign work includes Second Look, medical parole and compassionate release, and work with Liberate, Don't Incriminate, and Care-Based Safety. Both projects are committed to dreaming and working into existence a community rooted in healing and transformation, not punishment, vengeance, and cages. She has also organized around the full liberation of LGBTQIA plus people and sees the interactions of criminal justice reform work, and LGBTQIA plus liberation work, the women's rights work, as inextricably linked. Natalie and her wife, Tashina, are building their family and community in Washtenaw County. And I agree with you, my girl, Natalie. You know you my homie. So with no further ado, welcome Natalie Holbrook-Combs.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks, MI-CEMI, for having this awesome forum today. I am really glad to be here with Mikayla and Zack, and to talk about this super important work. So Mikayla was really hitting on how storytelling can actually is movement building work, and narrative work is movement building work. And so I just want to pick up on a couple of things that Mikayla was talking about in terms of building relationship with people when we're actually using their story, and how important it is to have relationship-based storytelling over transactional-based storytelling. That doesn't mean we shouldn't compensate people for their time and energy in providing stories for campaign work, but it does mean that we need to be there and in their corner when we're collecting story. And I come at this from a little bit different space because I'm working with people in prison. And so compensation is difficult when people are living in prison. And what I see as being, instead of transactional, relational, is that we can actually be there in somebody's corner for them and advocate, hopefully, around the issues that might come up in the context of prison, whenever we are working with them to collect story and narrative work to build bigger movement on the ground out here in the free world and in prison too. So a couple of things that I want to hit on. I'm gonna go through actual storytelling campaigns that we've engaged on in this work over the last many years, and give you some like concrete examples of story collection. I put into the chat the Let Me Tell You guide that we send into people in prison to develop a website I'm going to talk about in more detail in just a minute. But I believe with all of my heart that we have to shift narrative out in the community and within prisons and caged places, from ones rooted in punishment and retribution to narratives rooted in the potential for change, transformation, and redemption. And part of that is we need to collectively pull story together so that we're not ever creating poster children for movement work, because we're all human and we all stumble. And if we can stumble together and rise up together, it's much more powerful than one story getting circulated out there again and again, because that's how trauma media works. That's how sensationalistic media works. It's hyper focusing on one story or one element of, or one dimension of a human being, instead of collectively looking at the whole, looking at all of these people that make up situations, make up narrative. So I truly believe that collective story matters. And Jen, could you put Let Me Tell You up there on the website so folks can see it? And so in that, yep, we can see it. Thank you so much. So in that vein, this was during COVID and we were all Zooming a whole bunch. A group of folks from MI-CEMI, from AFSC, from Safe and Just, from My Michigan Liberation, we came together and we had these very complex conversations about how to get stories from people in prison who are serving long time that aren't necessarily just about the worst moment in somebody's life or their case or how they landed in prison, but actually reflected who the person might be today, or a really wonderful thing that happened in their life, or and the Carceral State Project, sorry, and PCAP were super involved in this. And we spent a year developing guidelines, protocols, discernment practices, the tools that we sent into the people to actually collect story. And if we had more resources, we would be updating this all of the time. My dream had been that we'd have an interactive website where we could actually interact with the stories, and the people that are represented and their words that are represented could get story back from us about our reactions to what they had shared with us. And that didn't happen in that way, but it's still a great tool to use in any kind of organizing work, because these are really humanistic stories of people who have been in prison for a very long time. And the reason we were focusing on all aspects and all dimensions of a person is because prison is harmful. We all know that. It's a terrible place to live. Conditions of confinement are traumatic. They're harsh on people. People who already have been traumatized in their histories are further traumatized in prison. And we don't need to embellish the problem of prison. And I see that happening in movement work at times, that we sort of hyper sensationalize the stories, or we focus on the trauma of prison, when people who are living in prison are very multidimensional humans. And let's focus on a best moment in their life, or what was their childhood like? Where were the moments of joy in their childhood? And so just trying to show the whole dimension of people in story collection, and really focusing on triumph, joy, problem solving, strength, all that kind of stuff. We want wide audience, so we don't want to be just talking to echo chambers of people who agree with us. We want to be able to relate. And while we don't have the time or resources to teach storytelling or writing, how to write your story or tell it out loud, for every person in prison, we can provide guidance the best that we can through the mail, through these, the guide that I put in the chat, and then through sometimes communications with people. So I just want to make sure. Oh, I wanted to put this question out to you all, because we are so hyper focused on exposing, consuming, and digesting trauma. And how do we pivot to the power of a person outside of the harm or oppression that they've experienced, and really lift them up as their whole person, and kind of keep that as like a baseline for how we go about doing movement work and storytelling more effectively. So I wanted to put that out there to you all. I hope you all can take time to go through this website and look at the stories. And if you want to leave comments or respond to them, we will get them to the person. I'm going to focus a little bit more on a couple of other organizing activities that we've engaged in at AFSC over the years. And one of them is this was, I think, in 2017. We had a really great day with 12 people who'd done a lot of time in our home now. And we created a video. We had a roundtable discussion for 5 hours. We had lunch, we provided stipends to people, and we developed this video. And it was really a beautiful way to collect story, because we talked for a good solid 2 hours in this kind of focus group. People had all the questions, like Zack talked about having questions in advance. They had the questions we would be considering in the facilitated dialogue. And then we had this brilliant young filmmaker there who filmed it all and knew where we were focusing, what we were trying to focus on, which was the successes of the people who had done long time and were now home. And so I found it to be a really powerful, and probably too long for most public consumption, but we've used it in a lot of educational forums and political education forums to share their stories. And then we also distilled it into a report afterwards, so that we have this report of the people that were in the video. So I'm going to put the report in there too, and it's called Ending Perpetual Punishment. And this was us trying to get Governor Snyder to grant more commutations, and then I was just really grateful for the folks in the video to open themselves up and share their experiences. And so that's the report also in the chat. And then I want to talk to you all a little bit more about when we are dealing with really traumatic story. The messenger does not have to be the person that was traumatized. And if we are in deep enough relationship with people in the work, we can be the messengers for them. And Kim knows this. Kim Hunter was part of Sawatu's Freedom Team. And I really want to be clear that when in her Freedom Team work, we all heard her tell the story of what it was like to give birth while she was in prison, and to go through her pregnancy experience, and to not be able to hold her baby after for long after he was born, and to not have family there, and to have 4 officers armed in the room because they put them on hyper alert. We heard all of this stuff from her, and she didn't have to keep telling the story. We could tell the story if we needed to, and she could then focus on the solutions that we developed to try to get at the problem of what they did to pregnant women in prison. And so she could, when she speaks out about it, she can say, there's breastfeeding allowed now in visiting room. There are, a loved one is allowed bedside while a woman is delivering a baby. That was like a huge thing. Her mom sat in the parking lot at St. Joe's, hoping that we were going to get the governor to let her come in and be there with her. And that didn't happen, but it's now happening for other women who are also allowed to have a doula. And so she can focus on the solutions and the victories, and not the horrendous things that happened to her. And so I just put that out as a reminder to everybody about how important it is for us to be in such good relationship with people that they would trust us with their stories, so that we can tell them if they cannot, we can be there in their stead. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Natalie. That was actually really deep. That story of having a baby in prison is something that, me being formerly incarcerated, I think of my prison experience and what I've saw. I never have thought about it from that perspective, to see it on that level. Also, I wanted to highlight another thing that you spoke about, was the sensationalizing the trauma of prison, as if it's not as traumatic as it is already, right? In dealing with a lot of the work that we do, I've often heard people either traumatize it even, or sensationalize the trauma, or in even some instances try and romanticize it and make it sound sexy, right? So I appreciate your acknowledgement of like that not being necessarily the way to go. And that being said, I haven't checked the chat, so let me go into the chat and see if we have questions for you directly from the chat. We got a lot of support for you. We got a lot of people saying things about it, but not necessarily questions per se on that aspect. So with that being said, we have a few minutes still to kind of open up the floor and have a group conversation. Is there anyone that had anything that they would like to add or pour into the chat at this time?
I just have a question. I didn't have time to write it out. First of all, thank y'all, everyone that presented. I'm not sure if it's done with presentation yet or not, but question I had, well, it was twofold. Was one, when it comes to, so far everyone has spoken and mentioned about compensating folks to share their story, and I know outside of just media and communications, but just in general organizing, we often get stories from folks to get them active and to share and to take action. But I never have thought about as far as compensating them. I don't know if it's like, if that makes a real difference, if it's like versus action versus more for media. Is there a difference there? And then again, just an example. I don't know if you can give exact numbers. Like, how does that work? How does the payment work? Is it every time they do something with y'all? Every time they go to Lansing, or like how is it compensating working? And then two, how important is it to share stories of successes, like a compilation or a video or presentation or media story that shows we got this passed or changed because of X, Y, and Z? So as an example to get folks to do more work with y'all.
Good questions. Did you guys get those? So question number one, and it's actually in the chat, also was asked to the entire panel. So I'll just reiterate it. And that was the question of how does the compensation work? It's probably different with each one of you guys, but like, are there actual, can you give actual numbers? How much do you typically compensate for different types of interactions, whether it's the someone giving a story written in print form or someone doing an interview or that type of thing? And then his second question was, what is the importance of success stories?
I mean, I can speak to how we generally compensate people. For the medically frail parole storytelling that we did, which Kate shared the video for that earlier. Justin, who was one of our storytellers, was featured in the interviews, and then he also came and testified at the Senate committee hearing, and we compensated him at basically $100 an hour. So he had some travel time. He sat for about 3 hours total in shooting, and then same for when he came back. We spent some time prepping for the his testimony in the Senate committee hearing. I think 2 hours, and then an hour like at the Senate committee hearing. So that's, again, trying to communicate that as upfront as possible so they know what to expect. And that's, I don't think any of these none of these projects are free, and so I just see that as something that just needs to be considered from the top as like part of the budget, as opposed to like, oh well, we need to hire a camera crews, and then and we should probably pay this person. It's like, okay, well, first there's people, like, who are the people we're telling, so we should compensate them, and then kind of fall in after that as opposed to an afterthought.
Got you. Did either of you want to add to that, Natalie or Mikayla?
Yeah, I can add on to that as well. So usually for youth and adults, they typically receive $100 per hour, and if it's half an hour or less, usually it's $50. And kind of just as Zack was saying, like, we respect their time and their experience, and we know they don't have to speak to us, or they don't have to share their time and space with us and their stories. And we want to honor that and respect that by compensating them.
I can speak to the second part of the question, if you would like me to.
Sure.
Around successes. I mean, I didn't get to throw this in here, I don't think. Not everybody who's been impacted is necessarily going to be the best storyteller, and we got to be real about that. So I want to make sure that we grapple with the kinds of dilemmas that come up when we're thinking about ethics. That is one of a dilemma that might come up, and we should grapple with it. So I wanted to put that out there. But in terms of successes, I think I had this dream. This was years ago when we used to do like deep advocacy. Any letter, any communication that came to AFSC, we we would help a person the best we could. So it could be like they were writing to us about their hernia, and we would try to get them surgery for it, which was an impossible task. And so that I was feeling so let down often. I was like, we need to have just a little victories storytelling site of some sort where we're collecting like when we actually are victorious on something, when somebody gets a knee replacement after going to bat for 2 years with the Department of Corrections to try to get their knee or hip replaced or whatever, or when we get freedom for somebody. Like, we really have to sort of celebrate it. And I think that in all of our work, celebration is super important. I don't want to call things success. I don't want to ever label something a success that just because somebody goes to school after prison and gets a degree that makes them a success, whereas somebody who gets a full-time job and is working their tail off and making money for their family, that's also a success. So I never want us to like say that one is more of a success or not, because we tend to hyperfixate on success just like we do trauma. But I think it's super important that we share victories, celebrations, and we talk about the joy of being alive and what people are capable of after they've been through so much hardship.
I appreciate that addition, Natalie, because you're right. Success doesn't just represent in one way, right? There are different levels of success, and it's represented through a lot of the different stories, right? We had an email question, but I think Jen said we kind of got it covered in that last portion. So there was another question put in the chat for the entire panel, and that was Zack talked about the challenge of making sure content speaks to audiences that are already familiar on, or that are not already familiar on board. Is there an example where this has been particularly challenging? How did you work through that challenge? And that's, I guess we'll start with Zack since it was presented from your conversation.
Yeah. Well, to hop on the success thing really quickly. Yeah, I think that's super important. And I don't think I haven't seen anybody in the nonprofit realm who does that well. I don't think anybody really goes into nonprofit or like, social justice issues because they want to go and then take a bunch of credit for it, but we do need to take credit for it. And it's something that's constantly on my mind is, trying to how to uplift like the work that my colleagues and stuff do at SJM and like how impactful that is, and whether that led to like a legislative, a law getting passed or not, really trying to lift them up, because this is hard work. It's depressing work. There are enough, the challenges are, a mile long. So when we have something that we can celebrate as a success, I think it's really important to lift that up. And we deserve the credit. I keep telling myself that because it's harder to, it's easier to say it than to live that. But so if I can at least do that for other people, I'll start with that, then maybe myself at some point. How to reach people who are sort of on the fringes. I mean, the short answer is I don't know. I mean, in a personal way, I think, it's finding common ground and shared experience with people. Doing that, through like broadcast media is tough because like people are inherently unique. And so you can't just paint with a broad brush that's like, oh, here's something that'll resonate with everybody. Like, I try to get as much cold feedback on stuff that I produce as possible. So where I just don't prep people, I don't give them any context. I'm just like, hey, here's a project I'm working on. You know where I work, but that's it. Can you watch it and like give me the like meanest feedback you can about it? Like what parts didn't make sense, what parts made sense, like what parts stuck out to you. And I found a couple friends who are good about being very candid about that. And that's just invaluable because I can't forget the stuff that I've heard in the full interview. And so, and then I have to cut a bunch of that out. And so sometimes you miss that context and things don't necessarily line up when you actually play it back in the cut down version, or just things, certain things stick out to certain people that didn't as much to me. So I'm always trying to get as much feedback on that as possible and work that into going forward. And, I leverage my own experiences as a white, dude, and like what were the things that like, I was raised fairly conservatively, I had a lot of really cringy stuff, hot takes in high school that are, not great to look back on. And I think about like, what are the things that changed my perspective on those. What were the stories that I heard other people tell, or like what were the relationships that I had, and what about those relationships that I had changed my perspective, and try to think about how I can apply similar things and hope that works for other people too. But I guess at the end of the day, it's really hard to quantify if that's effective or not, because most of the, like, if we have a screening or something, that's a lot of people who are coming are already supporters. So not that it's not great to hear their feedback that a video is good. That's always nice, but if there was a way to get a bunch of skeptics in a room and make them watch something, that would be really great. So if somebody has the lead on that, let me know.
Right.